January 17th, 1945. The Forest of Aden. Dawn breaks cold and colorless on the snow that has turned from white to gray under the boots of two armies. The air smells of wet pine and diesel fuel. In the distance, the roar of engines mingles with the frozen branches of the trees. German tankers are closing in on their Panzer IV, their breath visible in the cold air, their hands wrapped around tin cups of Azart coffee that tastes like burnt acorns. They are tired, not the fatigue of a sleepless night, but the deep weariness of the bones of men who have been retreating for months, who have seen their fuel supplies dwindle, their ammunition trucks arrive half-empty, their replacement crews growing younger and less trained with each passing week. And yet this morning, something flickers in their eyes. Not exactly hope, but defiance. The Americans are coming. They know it all, but the Germans have seen American armor before. They have seen the Sherman, and they laugh. The laughter was not born of cruelty. It was born of experience. The German tankers had faced the standard Sherman with its 75mm gun and had come to know it was needed. They had learned to respect American numbers, American air power, American logistics. But the Sherman itself, the tank for tanks, inspired no fear. Its armor was thin. Its main guns struggled to penetrate the frontal plates of German medium tanks, let alone the heavier Tigers and Panthers. The Sherman burned easily when hit. So easily that American crews nicknamed it Ronson, after the cigarette lighter company whose slogan promised that it would light the first time every time. German tank commanders knew this. They had seen Shermans cook, as the tanker called. Their innards would burst into flames that would consume men in seconds. The Germans had superior tanks. They knew it. The Americans knew it. And yet the Americans kept coming. But, on this particular morning, as the low winter sun fought through the clouds, the German crews near the village of Hafali saw something different. Some of the rough olive shapes emerging from the trenches looked like Shermans. Their turrets held guns with barrels that seemed too short, too thick, almost comically stubborn, compared to the graceful length of the German 75mm or the terrifying range of the 88. Some chuckled. Some joked. What kind of gun was that? They wondered. It looked like a howitzer. It looked like an artillery piece, the kind you strap to the back of a truck and use to hurl shells at distant targets. Why would the Americans mount something like that on the turret of a tank? It made no sense. The Sherman was already out. Why make it worse? What the Germans didn't know, what they couldn't have known from looking at that short barrel, was that they were looking at a revolution in armored warfare. They were looking at the M4 Sherman 105mm as a one-of-a-kind. A tank designed not to compete with other tanks, but to destroy them in ways that conventional anti-tank guns couldn't. They were looking at a weapon that would rewrite the rules of how tanks fought each other. And within an hour, some of those laughing German tankers would be dead, their panzers shattered, not by the piercing needle of an armor-piercing round, but by the sledgehammer of high-explosive shells that treated armor not as a puzzle to penetrate, but as an eggshell. To understand how the Americans arrived at this unexpected weapon, we have to go back to the summer of 1942, when American armor doctrine was still taking shape, still learning painful lessons in the deserts of North Africa. The United States Army entered World War II with light tanks and a philosophy borrowed from the cavalry. The belief that tanks existed primarily to exploit supply lines of success and raids. Tank destroyers would take over the enemy's armor. The tanks would do the rest. The theory seemed reasonable in the staff colleges. It fell under fire. The Germans did not separate their tanks from their tank destroyers. Their Panzer certainly held up to other tanks, and their tanks were good. The Panzer IV, upgraded with a longer 75mm gun, could hit a Sherman at ranges where the Sherman could not respond. The Tiger, with its 88mm gun and massive frontal armor, was nearly impenetrable from the front. The Panther, introduced in 1943, combined excellent armor with a fast-firing 75mm gun that could penetrate Sherman armor at ridiculous distances. American tank crews found themselves at a disadvantage. They adapted to the tactics, using numbers and maneuvers, using air support, using indirect approaches, but they also began demanding better tanks. The American response was complex. It would take years to design and develop a new heavy tank. Thousands had been built. Supply chains were established. Training manuals were written. Spare parts were stocked in repair depots. Starting over was not a realistic option. Instead, the Americans did what they did best. They modified. They experimented. They tried different guns, different armor configurations, different types of ammunition. One of these experiments involved taking the M4 Sherman chassis, a proven and reliable platform, and the M4 howitzer, a 105mm artillery piece commonly used by field artillery battalions. The idea was not entirely new. Howitzers had previously been mounted on tank chassis, what the military called assault guns, vehicles designed to provide direct fire support to infantry. The Germans had their own Stug series. The Soviets had the SUER. These were not tanks in the traditional sense. They had limited traverse, fixed casemates instead of rotating turrets, and were intended to blast bunkers and strongpoints, not engage enemy artillery. The American M4 105 was different. It retained the fully rotating turret. It looked like a Sherman. It moved like a Sherman. It could fight like the Sherman when needed, but it had a special purpose. It was a close support tank designed to engage attacking infantry and destroy anything that resisted. The M4 105 had a short-barreled howitzer that fired a 33-pound shell. The shell was not designed to penetrate armor using kinetic energy. It was designed to explode. The standard anti-tank round, the armor-piercing shot, was essentially a very hard, very fast projectile that hit steel plate with sheer force. If it penetrated, it would tear apart the enemy tank, personnel, and equipment. If it didn't penetrate, it did nothing. The 105mm high-explosive shell worked on a different principle. It contained a large bursting charge of TNT. When it hit a target, it exploded. The explosion created a massive shock wave, a pressure pulse that spread outward in microseconds. Against soft targets, buildings, treachery, the effect was devastating. Against armored vehicles, the effect was more subtle, but no less deadly. Armor is strong, but it is not infinitely strong. It is designed to resist penetration, deflecting projectiles to absorb impacts within certain limits. But armor is also brittle. It can break. It can spool. When a large high-explosive shell explodes against the hull of a tank, the shock wave doesn't just bounce off. It propagates through the metal. Welds, the joints where armor plates are joined together, become stress points. The recoil can crack welds. It can split seams. It can cause the inner surface of the armor to crack and send razor-sharp shards of steel flying through the crew compartment. This is called sabotage, and it can kill everyone inside the tank without the shell penetrating the armor. The men inside don't see any holes. They might think they're safe, and then the inside of their tank is filled with supersonic metal shrapnel. Furthermore, tanks aren't solid blocks of steel. They have hatches, vision ports, gun mantlets, ventilation grills, weak points where the armor is thin or where mechanical components must pass through the hull. A high-explosive shell detonating near one of these weak points can encase it, jam the turret rings, disable the tracks, burst the fuel tanks, explode the ammunition. The explosion can take out external equipment, antennas, optics, blinding and immobilizing the tank. Even if the tank itself survived, the crew would be concussed, deafened, unconscious, bleeding from the bursting eardrum, and suffering internal injuries from the high-pressure wave. The Germans had armored their tanks to resist armor-piercing shot. They had sloped their armor, thickened it, hardened it, but they had not designed it to withstand the repeated hammering of large-caliber, high-explosive shells at close range. Why would they? The artillery was several kilometers behind the front lines. The idea that a tank carrying a howitzer would get within direct firing range and begin bombarding enemy weapons seemed absurd. It defied the logic of tank combat. And yet the Americans began doing exactly that. The first M4 Shermans entered service in 1943. They were issued in limited numbers to specific tank battalions, usually one per platoon or company, intended to provide fire support on call. The crews trained with them and found them strange at first. The gun's muzzle velocity was slower than the standard 75mm. Different calculations were required for aiming. The velocity was more arcing, but the shells were much more powerful. A 105mm high-explosive round could bring down a building. It could eliminate a machine gun nest. It could turn a German strongpoint into a smoking pit. The infantry liked to be around them, but tank combat was a different matter. Doctrine said that the 105 Sherman was not to hunt enemy tanks. That was the job of the 75mm Shermans and tank destroyers. The 105 was to stay back and lob shells on soft targets. However, doctrine is written in peacetime by men who have never been fired upon. On the battlefield, doctrine bends. Tanks encounter enemy armor unexpectedly. Situations develop. Targets of opportunity appear. An American tank crew, practical and aggressive by nature, begins to discover that the stubby 105 can do what high-velocity guns cannot. Picture this. A Sherman 105 rounds a corner in a French village and finds itself face-to-face with a Panzer IV 70 meters away. According to the rules of tank dueling, the Sherman is at a disadvantage. The Panzer's gun can penetrate the Sherman's frontal armor. The Sherman's howitzer, firing high-explosive rounds, theoretically cannot penetrate the Panzer's armor. But the American gunner does not hesitate. The 105mm shell, which weighs a small child, crosses the distance in a fraction of a second and crashes into the Panzer IV's frontal glass. There is no clean hole. Instead, the entire front of the German tank begins to shake. The explosion is blinding, deafening. When the smoke clears, the Panzer is motionless. Its crew does not bail. Later, when American engineers inspect the wreckage, they find no penetration, but the welds along the sea of glass have cracked. The driver's hatch has been blown half off its hinges. Inside, the crew is dead, killed by the damage and the commotion. The tank was technically armored, but not a tank. Such stories began to accumulate. A Tiger tank, the pride of the German Panzer forces, was repeatedly hit by 105mm shells until its turret ring jammed and it could no longer rotate its gun. A Panther took a 105 round on the side that did not penetrate, but the hole cracked so badly that the tank had to be abandoned. A Stug III assault gun. Its casemate, a 105mm shell, burst open along the seam after it hit its roof. High-explosive shells didn't always kill enemy tanks outright, but they disabled them. They left them immobile, blind, defenseless, and in tank warfare, a tank that couldn't move or fire was a dead tank. The Germans began to take notice. In after-action reports, in letters home, in interrogations of captured crew members, a new theme emerged. The Americans had a tank with a shotgun that fired a powerful round. It didn't look dangerous, but it was. Some German tankers began calling it a stumbling block. Others called it more Serenone, a mortar cannon. They learned to recognize its silhouette and prioritize it as a target. But recognition didn't mean they could always stop it. By 1944, the Americans were fielding more and more Sherman 105s, and they were using them offensively, not as artillery platforms, but as weapons of conquest. The Battle of the Bulge, the winter of 1944 to 1945, brought it into sharp focus. The German attack initially caught the Americans off guard. Panzers pushed deep into the American lines. The weather grounded Allied aircraft. For a few desperate weeks, the American tanks had to be without air support, something they had not had in months. Tanks fought tank to tank, in close quarters in forests and villages, where the difference in gun performance mattered less, and crew skill and firepower mattered more. The Sherman 105 proved its worth. In brutal close-quarters fighting around Bastogne, in the 5th around Saint, in nearly 100 nameless crossroads and scattered towns. The stubborn Shermans broke open German tanks that were considered almost impregnable. One account stands out. A company of Shermans, including 2 105-equipped tanks, was defending a road junction near the village of Shannon. A German column arrived, led by a Panther. The standard Shermans fired first, their 75mm shells bouncing off the Panther's frontal armor. The Panther returned fire, knocking out one Sherman immediately. The American formation began to fall back. Then one of the 105 Shermans, led by a lieutenant whose name is lost to history, moved forward rather than backward. It closed the gap to less than 100 meters, much closer than any sensible tank commander would have willingly engaged a Panther. The German crew, surprised by the aggression, fired and missed. Its first shell hit the Panther's turret. The explosion was so violent that eyewitnesses thought the Panther's ammunition had run out. But there was no secondary explosion. The turret simply stopped moving. The Panther tried to turn. The Sherman fired again, hitting a side hole. The Panther shuddered to a halt. Smoke began to pour from its sides. The crew bailed out. The German column, seeing their lead tank destroyed by what they considered an inferior opponent, hesitated. This hesitation cost them dearly. The American company rallied, and the German attacks stopped. This engagement was not unique. It was repeated in various parts of the front. What made the 105 Sherman so effective was not that it was a better tank than the Panther or Tiger. It was not. In a long-range duel, it would lose. But tank combat is rarely a long-range battle. It is chaos, it is confusion, it is close quarters and sudden confrontation and decisions made under fire. In these circumstances, the ability to deliver massive firepower quickly became more valuable than the ability to penetrate thick armor at 2,000 meters. The 105 Sherman could fire a shell that would almost certainly damage or disable a target without penetrating it. This was often enough. The psychological effect should not be underestimated. German tank crews were trained to fear armor-piercing shells. They knew what penetration felt like. They knew the sound of molten metal, the flash, the spray. The high-explosive rounds were different. The explosion was bigger, louder, more violent. It felt wrong. A tank commander who survived a 105mm hit, even though his tank was still functioning, was shaken. His confidence was shaken. He knew that another hit could crack his hull, jam his turret, hit him in a way that the armor could not stop. German after-action reports of late 1944 and early 1945 frequently mentioned the American short-barreled tank and noted its devastating effect. Meanwhile, the Americans were learning. Tank crews began to experiment with tactics adapted from the 105. They learned to use high-explosive shells not only against soft targets, but also as a first strike against enemy armor to break welds and disable systems, followed by armor-piercing rounds with 75mm Shermans. To finish the job, they learned to target specific parts of enemy tanks, aiming for turret rings and hatches where the effect of the explosion would be maximized. They learned to fire in salvos, several 105 Shermans concentrating their fire on a single target, repeatedly and hesitantly overpowering it until some way was found. Theorists slowly caught on, as ideologists always do. By 1945, the official manual began to acknowledge that the M4 105 could be used in an anti-tank role in certain situations. The tankers themselves had known this for a year. They had proven it with their own lives, and the Germans had learned it the hard way. Let's pause and consider the broader implications. The M4105 represented a departure from the dominant philosophy of tank warfare, which held that tanks must have high-velocity guns to penetrate enemy armor. This philosophy was not entirely wrong. High-velocity guns are effective, but it was imperfect. The M4105 demonstrated that there was more than one way to kill a tank. Armor-piercing rounds penetrate with kinetic energy. High-explosive rounds are destroyed by explosion and shock. Both are deadly. Both have their place. This realization had its roots in older military thinking, siege warfare, and fortification. A castle wall can be high and thick and still fall if you weaken it, or hit it, or bomb it long enough. Armor is like that. The Germans, by focusing on making their tanks resistant to penetration, had inadvertently made them vulnerable to a different kind of attack. The Americans, eager to experiment and improve, had stumbled upon a solution. The 105 Sherman was not a perfect weapon. It was not the ultimate tank. It had flaws. The howitzer had a relatively short range. Its low velocity meant that it was difficult to hit targets moving at a distance. It fired fewer rounds than the 75mm Sherman, only 66 rounds compared to 90 for the standard gun. Its high-explosive shells were less effective against sloping armor, which could deflect some of the blast away from the hull. Against the very heavy German tanks, the King Tiger, the 105 might struggle to inflict decisive damage from the front. But these limitations were known and accepted. The 105 was a specialized tool. It was not meant to replace the standard Sherman. It was meant to complement it, to provide capabilities that the 75mm gun could not. In the fighting across France through the Siegfried Line in Germany itself, the M4105 Sherman was there, nose first and deadly, breaking open bunkers and pillboxes, and when necessary, enemy tanks. The Germans never developed an effective countermeasure. They could destroy the 105 Sherman if they saw them first, if they had the range, if they had the fuel and ammunition to fight. But by 1945, the Germans rarely had these advantages. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and outgunned. The 105 Shermans kept coming. The image of this stubborn gun has a symbolic weight. It looked wrong. It looked harmless. It seemed like it shouldn't work. And yet it did. There's something very American about it. America didn't win World War II by building the best tanks. The Sherman wasn't the best tank. Americans won by building enough tanks, operating them, adapting them to new roles, outmaneuvering their enemies, and outmaneuvering their own. The M4105 was a product of that approach. It wasn't the best in theory, but it was effective, and it was available, and it got the job done. Consider the material symbolism. Each 105mm high-explosive shell contains about 4 pounds of TNT. 4 pounds doesn't seem like much until you consider what 4 pounds of high explosive can do. It can turn a concrete wall into rubble. It can lift a truck off the ground. It can blast steel plate. The American economy can produce these shells by the millions. By 1945, the German economy was collapsing. German tank crews were rationed to a handful of rounds a day. They learned to count every shot because they had no choice. American tank crews fired whenever they saw a target. They had shells to spare. With its big shells, the 105 Sherman was a symbol of American industrial power. Every round it fired was a reminder that the Americans could afford to throw more explosives at problems, that they had more where the Germans lacked. The crews operating the 105 Sherman were volunteers, like all American tank crews. They came from farms and factories, from cities and small towns. They were trained in a few months and sent overseas to fight a war most of whom had barely heard of before Pearl Harbor. They were not professional soldiers. They were civilians in uniform. And yet they learned to operate complex machines, under fire, to coordinate with infantry and artillery, to make separate decisions that meant life or death. They complained about the cold and food and mail that never came. They griped about their equipment and their officers and the dirt. But they fought and won. Here is a recorded interview with a Sherman 105 gunner, conducted decades after the war. He describes the engagement in Germany in the final weeks before the surrender. His tank was advancing through a forest when they encountered a German roadblock, a failed tree trunk reinforced with landmines and covered by a Panther. The Panther fired first, hitting one of the accompanying Shermans. The American tank scattered. The gunner's tank, the 105, maneuvered to take a side shot. He fired 3 rounds in quick succession. The first missed. The second struck the Panther's bridge and jammed it. The third hit the ray deck and set it on fire. The German crew bailed out. The gunner remembers no sense of victory, just relief that it was over, and he was still alive. He remembers the weight of the shells, how heavy they were, how his arms were bouncing by the end of the day. He remembers the smell of propellant, the ringing in his ears that never went away. He remembers his loader, a kid from Ohio who was killed by a sniper 2 weeks later. He remembers that the war was not glorious. It was work, dangerous, tiring, horrible work. But he also remembers that his tank, with its short, stubborn gun that everyone called ridiculous, had done its job. It had protected him and his crew. It had, in some small way, contributed to the end of the war. And it mattered. As the war in Europe was winding down, the M4105 Sherman continued its service. They were there at the Rhine crossing, blasting German positions on the opposite bank. They were there in the breakout across Germany, supporting the rapid armored thrusts that cut the country in half. They were there when the concentration camps were liberated, their crews seeing first-hand evidence of Nazi atrocities, a sight that justified every hardship they had endured. They were there at the end, standing in shattered German cities, their guns finally falling silent. The lessons of the M4105 were studied after the war. Military analysts examined the wreckage of German tanks and documented the effects of high-explosive shells. They found blast holes, split welds, and damage exactly as reported. They confirmed that the large caliber of its rounds could disable or destroy armored vehicles without penetrating them. This knowledge influenced post-war tank design. The Soviets, who had always favored large-caliber guns, continued to develop tanks with larger guns that fired larger shells. The Americans and British began to look for multi-role main guns that could effectively fire both armor-piercing and high-explosive rounds. The idea that a tank gun should be solely an anti-tank weapon began to fade. The M4105 itself was relatively quickly obsolete. The Sherman chassis was replaced by more modern designs. The 105mm howitzer was eventually superseded by more modern weapons. But it represents the principle that massive firepower can only be as effective as the armor penetration remains. Modern tanks have guns that can fire a variety of ammunition. They can penetrate armor with kinetic rounds. They can destroy bunkers with high-explosive rounds. They can engage infantry with canister shot. The idea that a tank should be able to do many things, not just kill other tanks, is now somewhat understood. The M4105 was an early step in that direction. There is a deeper lesson here, one that goes beyond the technical details of armor and ballistics. The M4105 succeeded because it challenged assumptions. It asked, what if we don't play by the enemy's rules? The Germans had built tanks suited to long-range combat on the Eastern Front. The Americans responded not by building similar tanks, although they tried, but by building tanks that changed the nature of combat. They brought tremendous firepower to bear. They used numbers and mobility. They adapted. The Sherman 105, ugly and ungainly as it was, embodied that adaptation. War is not a science. It is not a formula. These are humans making decisions under pressure, often with incomplete information, often as opposed to operating according to textbooks. The best weapon is not always the most advanced or the most powerful. Sometimes, the best weapon is the one that surprises the enemy, that attacks from an unexpected angle, that exploits a vulnerability that no one had thought to defend. The M4105 did just that. It turned the German obsession with armor into a weakness. It proved that you don't always have to drill a hole in the shell to crack an egg. And there's a kind of poetry in that. Laughed at the stubby gun. They mocked it. They underestimated it. And then it killed them. There's a lesson in humility there, a reminder that confidence can become arrogance, that assumptions can become blind spots. The Germans assumed they knew what a tank gun should be like. They assumed that the short-barreled howitzer posed no threat. They were wrong, and that mistake led to their defeat on 1,000 battlefields. The American soldiers who manned the M4 105 Shermans were not thinking in these grand terms. They were thinking about survival. They were thinking about their buddies in the next tank over. They were thinking about going home. But in combat as they did, they held on to something bigger. They held on to the idea that ingenuity and resourcefulness mattered more than might. They held on to the idea that the democracy of farmers and factory workers, when pressed, could withstand a totalitarian war machine. They held on to the idea that freedom, messy and reformist, and often ineffective, was ultimately stronger than tyranny. The Sherman 105 was mass-produced. It was commonplace. It was available to ordinary people, and in their hands, it became extraordinary. This is the American way of war. There are not a few elite forces with the best equipment, although they have their place, but a large number of capable, motivated citizen soldiers, who, with sufficient equipment, well-supported and well-supplied, are willing to take risks and improve and do the job. The Sherman 105, with its stubborn gun and its big shells, was the embodiment of this philosophy. Now the war is over. The men who fought in those tanks are almost all gone. The tanks themselves are museum pieces, carefully preserved, their olive drab paint faded, their tracks silent. Visitors walk past them, and sometimes stop to read the plaques, to marvel at the size of the 105mm howitzer. But the plaques cannot express the noise, the fear, the cold, the exhaustion. They cannot convey the moment when a German tank rounds a corner, and you have 3 seconds to decide whether to fire or die. They cannot express the relief of surviving another day, or the grief of losing a crew member, or the dull ache of knowing that it will not end until one side can fight no more. What the plaques can tell us, if we read them carefully, is that ordinary people did extraordinary things, that a tank with a gun that seemed wrong, that defied all the rules of what a tank gun should be, turned out to be exactly what was needed. That innovation and adaptation won more battles than superior engineering. That the side that could learn, that could change, that could take a howitzer for artillery and put it on a tank turret and make it work. That side had an advantage that no thick armor could overcome. And here's a truth that goes beyond tanks, beyond World War II, beyond military history. It is the fact that assumptions limit us, that conventions, even useful ones, can become chains, that sometimes the solution to a problem looks nothing like we expected. The Germans expected tank guns to be long and fast. The Americans showed them that short and high explosive could work too. The Germans expected the Sherman to be easy prey. The Americans showed them that easy prey could bite back. This is the legacy of the M4105 Sherman. It's not that it was the best tank, because it wasn't. It's not that it won the war single-handedly, because it didn't. But that it represented a way of thinking, of questioning and experimenting and trying things that might not work, but just might. A refusal to believe that the enemy's advantages were insurmountable. This way of thinking about more than a single weapon wins wars. And so we remember the stubby gun. We remember the crews who loaded it and fired it, who stopped the suicide sequence because it was the only way to make it effective, who trusted their training and their equipment and each other. We remember that German tanks were hatched like eggs. Their crews never imagined that armor alone would not save them. We remember that wars are not fought with the strongest weapons, but with the most cunningly used. War is a crucible. It shows what works and what doesn't, what is necessary and what is merely conventional. The M4105 worked. It was necessary. And in the great ledger of World War II, in the long list of reasons why the Allies won the Axis, there is an entry for a tank that didn't seem dangerous, that violated the principles of tank design, but that broke the hulls of the Panzer and shattered the confidence of their crews. There is an entry for the stubborn giant, the Sherman, who had the last laugh. The snows of Eden melted. Spring came. The war ended. The tanks fell silent. But the lesson remains. Don't judge by appearances. Don't think the rules can't change. Don't underestimate a stubborn gun. It can crack you open like an egg. And in that simple truth, there is something profound about democracy, about innovation, about the resilience of free peoples in the face of oppression. The Germans built the Tiger and the Panther, and thought themselves invincible. The Americans built the Sherman, found it desirable, modified it, adapted it, used it in ways it was never intended, and won. This is the story of the M4105. This is the story of war. This is the story of what happens when ingenuity meets determination, when ordinary men are given the tools and the freedom to think for themselves, to improve, to find solutions that the manual never considered. The stubby gun was mocked, then feared, and in the end, it was further proof that the measure of a weapon, like the measure of a nation, is not what it looks like or what the experts predict, but what it does when everything is on the line and there is no room for error, and survival depends on being smart, not just strong. The Americans were not very strong. They were smarter. They were more flexible. They were more willing to change. And in the forge of war, those characteristics mattered more than the thickness of the armor plate or the length of the gun barrel. The M4105 Sherman proved that, with its short, fat, unimpressive howitzer. It shattered the confidence of the Wehrmacht. It shattered the myth of German invincibility. It worked. And now, decades later, when we look back on that war and ask what made the difference, we must count among the answers the willingness to try something new. To put a howitzer on a tank and see what happens. To ignore the laughter and prove the doubters wrong. That willingness, that spirit of innovation, born of frustration and sustained by determination, is as American as anything that came out of that war. It is the spirit that made the Liberty ships and the B-7 and the atomic bomb. It is the spirit that mobilized a nation, that turned factories into weapons, that took farmers and shopkeepers and turned them into soldiers and sailors and amen. It is the spirit that looked at a problem and said, there must be a way. And then there was one. The M4105 Sherman was no miracle. It was engineering. It was logistics. It was training and ideology and the accumulated experience of men under fire. But in its own modest way, it was also a symbol of everything that made victory possible. It was proof that freedom breeds creativity, that open societies can adapt more quickly than closed ones, that the collective ingenuity of millions of people thinking for themselves is always a match for the rigid hierarchies of totalitarian control. The Germans laughed at the short-nosed Sherman. They learned to let it go. They learned to fear it. And then they lost. The stubborn gun played its part. The men who served it did their job, and together they helped write the end of the worst war in human history. An end in which the forces of democracy, muddled and reformed and often ineffectual, proved stronger, disciplined, and ruthless, and ultimately breakable than the forces of tyranny. That is the legacy of the news. It is what we remember when we see what happened to that stubby on Sherman Hill in a museum. Silent and harmless now. a monument to a time when everything was at stake and the outcome was uncertain, and the only thing that mattered was finding a way to win. The Americans found a way. The M4105 was part of it, and the world is better for it. The sun sets on the old battlefield. The forests grow back. The villages have been rebuilt. But the lessons remain, etched in steel and memory, waiting for those who will take the time to learn them. Don't underestimate what looks weak. Don't assume you know all the answers. Don't laugh at a stubborn gun, because somewhere, someone is finding a way to make it work. And when they do, it will shatter your convictions like eggshells, and remind you that in the end, adaptability and ingenuity will always triumph over arrogance and rigidity. The M4105 Sherman taught the Worm Act that lesson. We have never forgotten it. To truly understand the impact of the M4105, we must examine not only what it did, but what it represented in the broader context of American military development. The United States entered World War II with an army ranked 17th in the world, smaller than Portugal's army, armed with outdated weapons and outdated doctrine. In less than 4 years, that army had become the most powerful military force on earth. The change was not just a matter of numbers. It was a change of mindset. In 1941, American military culture was conservative, hierarchical, slow to change. The lessons of World War I had been incompletely learned. The cavalry still considered itself cavalry, even though horses had been replaced by tanks. Artillery still dominated planning, even though air power was making static defenses obsolete. The idea that tanks should fight other tanks was controversial. Tank destroyers, fast and lightly armored, were supposed to take on enemy armor. Tanks were supposed to support the infantry. This division of labor made sense on paper. It fell apart in North Africa. When American armor first hit the German panzers in Tunisia in 1943, the results were devastating. At the Kasserine Pass, green American soldiers were defeated by experienced German tank crews. Shermans burned, crews died. The survivors learned a hard lesson. They learned that doctrine was useless if the enemy did not act on it. They learned that German tanks would engage them, hunt them down, kill them, regardless of what the American field manuals said the tanks were supposed to do. And they found that the 75mm gun on the Sherman was inadequate. The immediate response was to improve the Sherman's gun. The 76mm high-velocity gun was developed and put into production immediately. It could penetrate more armor than the 75mm. It was better, but it was not a revolution. It was an incremental improvement. The Germans responded with thicker armor. The race was on. Meanwhile, a parallel effort explored a different approach. What if, instead of trying to penetrate the German armor, the Americans brought more explosive power to bear on the tanks? What if brute force, applied correctly, could be a substitute for accuracy? The 105mm howitzer was not a new weapon. It had been in American service since the 1920s. It was used by field artillery to provide indirect fire support. It was reliable, powerful, and mass-produced. No one, and history does not record exactly who, suggested mounting it on the Sherman. The idea may seem strange. Howitzers are low-velocity weapons. They fire shells in high arcs. They are not designed for direct fire at armored targets. But the idea was tested. A Sherman chassis was mounted with a modified turret carrying an M4 howitzer. Test firings were conducted. The results were interesting. The 105mm high-explosive shell, when fired at close range at a stationary target, had far greater effects than the numbers suggested. Concrete blocks shattered. Steel plates shattered. The resulting explosion pressure, measured in pounds per square inch, was enormous. Engineers calculated that a direct hit on a tank, even a heavily armored one, would subject the hull to forces it was never designed to withstand. Welds would fail, armor would break, internal components would be damaged. The crew, even if not injured by shrapnel, would be incapacitated by the concussion. This was the theory. The theory was to be tested in battle. The first M4105 Shermans were sent to Italy in late 1943. They were issued to tank battalions advancing up the Italian peninsula, a region that favored defenders, a region where long-range shelling was impossible, and every town was a fortress. The 105 Shermans were initially used to blast German strongpoints, but in the chaos of the fighting, they inevitably encountered enemy artillery, and the crews, pragmatic and desperate, fired on the panzers with their howitzers. The reports that came back were astonishing. The 105 could kill tanks. Not reliable at long range, not against frontal armor at steep angles, but in close combat, at the brutal ranges that were common in Italian cities, the 105 was devastatingly effective. One Panzer was hit in the side by a 105mm shell that often failed to destroy it. Even the sidings were damaged, the tracks were blown out, the turret jammed, the crew bailed out. The tank was probably not completely destroyed, but it was out of combat. Talking tank crews requested another 105 Shermans. Commanders began using them not only to support the infantry, but also as part of an armored spearhead. The doctrine was slowly, grudgingly, as doctrine always is. By the time of the invasion of France, in June 1944, the M4 105 Sherman was a standard part of American tank battalions. Not the majority, but enough to make a difference. Normandy was a test. The country of Boccia, with its high headlands and narrow streets, was a nightmare for the invaders. German tanks and anti-tank guns could hide anywhere. Designed for close-quarters firepower, the 105 Shermans were ideal. They blasted through headlands. They demolished German positions. And when they encountered enemy armor, they engaged at ranges where the 105's slow speed was no match for its explosive power. An engagement recorded in the 2nd Armored Division's after-action report illustrates this. A platoon of Shermans, including the 105, was advancing along a sunken road near St. Lo. They were ambushed by a German Panther hiding in a field. The lead Sherman was killed and destroyed. The platoon was scattered. The Panther maneuvered to take a second target. The 105 Sherman, which was parked in a ditch, fired a short side shot. The commander, a Michigan sergeant, ordered his gunner to fire. The 105 shell hit the Panther's side skirt and exploded. The skirt, the thin armor designed to protect against charges of its size, was blown away. The main armor underneath did not penetrate, but the explosion shattered the road wheels and jammed the track. The Panther could not move. The second 105 round hit the turret, startling the crew. The Panther's commander opened his hatch to assess the damage, and was killed by machine gun fire from the American infantrymen flanking the tanks. The rest of the German crew surrendered. The engagement was routine. The 105 did not always achieve complete kills, but it did damage, maim, and demoralize. Overall, it was enough. The immobilized German tanks could be destroyed in other ways. By infantry with bazookas, by airstrikes, by outflanking the Shermans with 76mm guns. The 105 created opportunities. It changed the tactical calculus. The Germans saw. In intelligence reports captured after the war, German officers expressed their dismay at the American short-barreled tank. A report from the 116th Panzer Division stated that the weapon appeared to fire artillery shells and could damage tanks by the blast effect even without penetration. The report recommended that such tanks be engaged at maximum range before being locked up. But maximum range required visibility, and in the close quarters of Western Europe, visibility was a luxury. The 105 Shermans came close, and when they did, they were deadly. There was also a psychological dimension. Tank combat was terrifying. You were locked in a metal box full of fuel and ammunition, blind except for the narrow lines of sight, deaf to the noise of the engine, knowing that at any moment an enemy shell could hit you. The German tank crews had learned to overcome this fear. They trusted their weapon. They trusted their guns. The 88mm gun on the Tiger could hit a Sherman at a range where the Sherman could not respond. That knowledge was a comfort. It gave them confidence. The 105 Sherman undermined that confidence. A German tank commander who had survived a 105mm hit knew that even if his tank was still functioning, its armor would not have saved him. Luck had it that the shell had hit a strong point, or the angle of the blast had deflected something, or that the welds had caught this time. But next time, they probably wouldn't. And there would be a next time. The Americans always came back. They always had more tanks, more ammunition, more shells to throw at you. The grinding panic of facing an enemy who could afford to bombard you with more explosives until something broke the German morale of the war, in a way that was not outright murder. By late 1944, as Allied forces closed in on the German border, the Wehrmacht was a shadow of its former self. The best crews were dead, replaced by poorly trained young and old. Fuel was scarce. Ammunition was rationed. The industrial base was being bombed around the clock. And yet, the Germans fought with the desperation that comes from knowing that defeat meant capture, perhaps annihilation. In this final phase, the 105 Sherman came into its own. The Siegfried Line, Germany's western fortifications, was a maze of bunkers, dragon's teeth, minefields, and artillery that was barely visible. Breaking through with the required firepower, the 105 Sherman led the attack. They shot point blanc into the bunker aperture. They dropped the bullets. They suppressed the German anti-tank guns long enough for the infantry to close in and destroy them. And when the German tanks counterattacked, as they did with suicidal bravery at places like Aachen and Metz, the 105 Shermans were there, punching holes, jamming the turrets, forcing the Germans back. There is a photograph from that period, taken by an Army Signal Corps photographer. It shows an AM-40 105 Sherman parked in a German town square. The surrounding buildings are crumbling. The streets are littered with debris. The tank itself is covered in mud and scratches. The paint is worn away in places. The crew sits on the hull, tiredly smoking cigarettes. They look old, though most are in their early 20s. One of them is staring at the camera, and his eyes are vacant. He has seen a lot. The picture is black and white, grainy, but it captures something essential. Up to this point, the war had not been glorious. It was a job, a dirty, dangerous, tiring job. And these men were doing it with their stubbornly gunned tanks. The final battles in Germany in the spring of 1945 were one of confusion and despair. The German army was falling, but it was not surrendering. The fanatical SS units, and to the last extent, the Hitler Youth fought. Columns of American tanks raced across the country, cutting off retreating German forces, liberating concentration camps, capturing bridges and airfields. 105 Shermans were part of every major operation. They were at the Rhine crossing, their howitzers firing across the river to suppress German defenses. They were in the Ruhr pocket, encircling an entire German army group. When the war ended, they were in Czechoslovakia, their guns finally falling silent. The statistics are telling. American records show that the M4 105 Sherman scored a higher percentage of first-round hits on enemy armor than any other Sherman variant. Not because their guns were more accurate, but because they were engaged so closely that it was difficult to miss. They also suffered a higher casualty rate because they were exposed to enemy fire at such close range. The 105 Sherman crews were volunteers, often the most aggressive and experienced men in their battalion. They knew the dangers. They accepted them. They believed in their weapon. Stubbornly and unpleasantly as it was, because they had seen it work. When historians began to compile the record after the war, the M40 105 was often overlooked. It was not as famous as the Tiger or the Panther. not as popular as the standard Sherman. It existed in a middle ground, too specialized to be everywhere, too effective to be dismissed. But those who knew it, who had operated it or fought with it, remembered it. They remembered the flat crack of a 105mm howitzer firing differently than the sharp bang of a 75mm. They remembered the way the tank shook, the massive recoil, the retreat of a breach. They remembered loading the heavy shells, 2 men lifting them, sliding them into the breach, the smell of cordite and oil. They remembered the satisfaction of watching the enemy tank shudder and stop, knowing that they had done it, that their small, stubborn, inadequate-looking gun had done it. The story of the M4105 has a deep resonance, touching on the nature of war and technology and human ingenuity. The history of warfare is full of examples of unconventional weapons succeeding because they were not anticipated. The longbow in the Cree, the machine gun in World War I, the aircraft carrier in World War II. In each case, the weapon violated established norms. It did not fit the prevailing model of how war should be fought. And because it did not fit, it was dismissed at the outset. But reality does not care about models. Reality cares about what works. The M4105 worked. It worked because it solved a real problem: the difficulty of defeating German armor with the standard Sherman gun in a way that was practical and achievable, given American resources and production capabilities. It didn't have to invent a new tank from scratch. It used existing components, the Sherman chassis and the M4 howitzer, and combined them in a new way. It's classic American engineering, practical and results-oriented, more concerned with solving the problem than with theoretical beauty. And there's something about it that reflects the American character, or at least the American character as it was in the 1940s. A willingness to experiment, a lack of respect for tradition, a belief that if something isn't working, you try something else. This wasn't unique to America, but America had plenty of it. The Sherman itself was an example of something that was designed and put into production faster than any comparable tank program. The M4105 was an extension of that ethos. It was built because it could work, and when it worked, more were built. The German approach was different. German engineering was excellent, often superior to American engineering in terms of sophistication and efficiency. But German engineering was also tough. The Germans designed the Tiger as the ultimate tank, the perfect combination of armor and firepower. When the Tiger proved too expensive and slow to produce, they designed the Panther, which was both excellent and difficult to build. German tanks were masterpieces. They were over-engineered, complex, breakable, and impossible to produce in the numbers they needed. The Germans couldn't afford to experiment. They had to get it right the first time, and when they didn't back down. The Americans could afford to experiment. They had the industrial capacity, the resources, the margin for error. The M4105 was one of many experiments. Not all were successful, but enough. And the cumulative effect of all these practical, workable, good enough solutions was victory. It's worth considering. The Germans had better tanks, better guns, better optics, better weapons. On paper, they should have won, but they lost. They lost because war is not fought on paper. It is fought in mud, snow, and rain, under conditions where the perfect weapon breaks down and the perfectly good one keeps going. It is fought by tired men who need equipment that is easy to maintain and ammunition that is plentiful. It is fought by economies that can outrun the enemy, by logistical systems that can keep armies thousands of miles from home, by societies that can mobilize their full strength without breaking down. The M4105 Sherman, stubborn and simple, represents all of these. It represents the triumph of practicality over ideology, abundance over scarcity, adaptation over perfection. It represents a democratic way of war, where ordinary people with good tools can defeat elite forces with superior equipment. Because in the end, numbers and flexibility and the willingness to learn from mistakes matter more than any single technological advantage. And here is a lesson for our own time. We live in an age that worships technology, that assumes that the side with the best gadgets will win. History tells us otherwise. History tells us that the side that can adapt, that can innovate, that can turn a howitzer into a tank gun and make it work, has an advantage that no one can beat in sophistication. The M4 Sherman was not sophisticated. It was efficient. It was adequate. The war was over. The tanks came home. Most of those that survived were scrapped. The steel was recycled, used to build bridges, cars, and refrigerators. The 105mm howitzers were put back on the artillery or stored in depots. The crews went home, took off their uniforms, and went back to their farms, factories, and lives. They didn't talk much about the war. What was there to say? They did what needed to be done. They survived, or they had no friends, and somehow it was over. But the memory lingers. In museums where M4 Shermans are displayed, in books and documentaries, in faded letters and photographs, in stories passed down through families, the memory of a tank that seemed wrong, that shouldn't have worked, that the enemy laughed at until it shattered their confidence and their hull and their belief that German engineering would prevail. The Germans laughed, and then stopped laughing. And in that silence, in that moment when the laughter died down and fear took over, there is a truth. Arrogance is a mistake to underestimate. And the stubborn gun, the ugly duckling, the weapon that has violated all the rules, will crack you open like an egg if you give it a chance. That is the legacy. That is what we remember. Not just the tank, but what it represents. The idea that winning is not about getting the best of everything, but about using what you have in the best way possible. The idea that democracy, messy and reformative, has a power that can never be matched by tyranny, rigidity, and hierarchy. The idea that free people can work together to solve problems that dictators and their slave armies cannot. The M4105 Sherman fought for this idea. His crew believed in it. And when the war ended and the guns fell silent, this idea prevailed. The world was saved not by supermen, but by ordinary men with guns and plenty of bullets, and a determination to get close to the enemy and fight until the enemy could fight no more. News is the truth. We owe it to those who served to remember and understand and carry on. The stubborn gun cracked the enemy like an egg, and in doing so helped open up a future where freedom, not tyranny, would shape the world. We will never forget.